welcome back to Dark Blood Mechanical, but first I'd like to make one request for the viewers, and that is to hit the subscribe and notification bell, as it would really help out the channel. Alright, now that all the sappy crap is out of the way, let's get back to our build. If you haven't been following, the last episode we built our engine and we converted our fuel tank to an EFI system. In this video, I'm going to be going over the transmission assembly and installation of the drivetrain. To begin this, I've already washed, inspected, and organized all the internal components for the assembly. I'll start this by first facing the bell housing downward and fastening the front adapter plate and inserting my input shaft race without any shims. The output shaft assembly is pretty straightforward. There are some parts that need to be pressed in, which I didn't bother recording. But if you find any PDF online for a T56 rebuild, you can pretty much find the order of all these components. Okay, so at this point I'm setting up a dial indicator up top and I'm zeroing the gauge. I then lift up the input shaft from below and I gather the end play. I measured this a few times and I averaged about 60 to 61 thou of end play. Using a vernier caliper, I measure the shim packs until I get about 59 to 60 thou thickness. This would give me about 1 thou of end play, which is what I typically use for these transmissions. The process is similar with the countershaft, only we're going to use a 12mm threaded rod with some hardware to fasten into the countershaft. This time around we're going to measure the threaded rod using the dial indicator. As I pushed the countershaft from below and checked the end play, I had about 20 thou of clearance. And since we're going for another 1 thou of clearance, I'll be using a 19 thou shim pack. The extension countershaft is the last tolerance I'll check here. Using the 12mm threaded rod, we can slide the rod down and fasten it directly to the extension countershaft. And once again, using the dial indicator, we will check for the end play. 1 to 2 thou is what I aim for here as well. Now that the transmission is completely put together, we can give it a clean new coat of paint. There's just one last addition to the transmission, and it's the thrust bearing. We added an aftermarket remote bleeder kit to make it easier to bleed the system rather than having to do it from underneath the vehicle. We're officially at a point now where we can throw the drivetrain into the car. For fuel lines, I went a little bit overkill, but since this vehicle will be forced induction in the future, it's better to be safe than sorry. So I went with a -8 AN for the supply, and I went with a -6 AN for the return lines. The original truck mount for the alternator and the power steering pump didn't really fit up with our air cleaner for our intake, so we decided to use an ICT bracket system, and this looks a lot better than the factory mounts anyways. Alright, so this is where I'll confess some of my inabilities. I hate wiring, especially if I'm dealing with someone else's wiring. Although I have a background in some electronics, this is just not something I have a lot of patience for. I hate having to diagnose other people's diagrams and so forth. So after about half an hour of this, I went ahead and I just ordered a fully assembled harness for an LS swap, and I called it a day. We then cut a hole on the lower part of the firewall to help hide the harness. Moving on to our intake and injectors. We found a budget-friendly intake manifold with fuel rails, a 102mm throttle body, and hardware for dirt cheap on Amazon. We went with the low-profile one due to the hood clearance on the Firebird. Yeah, so this was a bit of an impulse buy, and it came to bite us in the ass later on. We got a set of injectors for a good price, but they were £210, which is way too much for this build. I'll touch on this subject in the next video. Now, one of the biggest struggles for us old school car guys is clean engine bays. This is very difficult to accomplish with sensors, so I tried to run the harness under the intake and as clean as I could get it. I definitely could have done a lot more to clean this up, but we didn't have the time to invest in that, so I kind of worked with what I had. For the fuel pressure regulator, we just used a Tanks Inc. rated at 35 to 70 psi. They're well priced and work pretty well. I mounted it to the center of the firewall, and I ran the fuel supply and return lines from behind the motor just to keep the engine bay a little bit cleaner.
That's sick. I always thought that 6-liter would work.
Oh yeah, we'll get it to work.
Yeah, I'm gonna buy all the fucking trucks I see now.
Yeah. Alright, so we can now move on to the transmission installation. It's pretty straightforward. We already installed our RXT twin disc clutch ahead of time. Of course, there's always a little bit of wiggling to get the input shaft aligned. So one thing I always do is I put some longer bolts or studs threaded into the block, and this helps align the transmission to the block while you're sliding it in. The crossmember for the transmission is something I fabricated a few years ago and was used on my own personal car. So this just needed some minor modifications and it fit pretty smooth. That pretty much wraps up our motor and transmission install. In the next episode, we'll do exhaust, tune, and test drive our build. Hope you guys enjoyed and learned something, and as always, thank you for watching Dark Blood Mechanical. Stay tuned for more projects.
I don't want friends, I want Audis. Smoking on booth and it's my weed. I check the bitch like I'm Mari. Sorry bitch, I don't say sorry. Look at my